Good afternoon and welcome. And my name is Erica Flores. I'm a resource specialist here at the Long Island RBERN. And I just want to welcome you to the afternoon breakout session here at the Long Island Teachers Institute 2023. And so before we get started, I just want to remind you again of the interaction guidelines. So please remain muted unless you're asked to unmute. You can turn your camera off if you would like to, but turn it on if you are asked to. And I encourage you to use the chat to interact with your colleagues. And of course, have a great time while you're here. And I also want to draw your attention to the QR code at the bottom of the screen. That QR code will bring you to the conference hub, the Padlet. I know we've shared it many times already, but I'm going to do one more time in the chat just in case you've lost it at some point today. And I would be remiss if I didn't share a little bit about how you can access Long Island RBERN resources on our website, but also you can join the mailing list there. And in a few weeks, you'll find all of the recordings from today's breakout sessions on YouTube. So I also invite you to grab that YouTube link. The certificate of attendance, that will be sent out once all the attendance is verified. It'll probably take maybe a week, possibly more. So you won't receive it instantaneously, just so you know, and usually it comes through right on my learning plan. So there's no need to sign into the chat. Your attendance is captured through Zoom automatically. So with that, I would like to introduce our presenter, Ariana Rosario. Thank you so much, Ariana, for being here to guide us in discussion on how to prevent the over and under identification of ELLs as student with disabilities. So Ariana comes to us from the North Syracuse Central Schools, and I am going to stop sharing and turn it over to her.
Hey, thank you so much for letting me be here with you today. I know I'm not from Long Island. Kelly Cordero invited me, and I'm very thankful that I'm able to be here today and learn with you guys and be able to share my little passion project for all of you. So can everybody see my screen okay? Awesome. Okay, so how to prevent the over and under identification of ELLs with disabilities. A little bit about me. My name is Ariana Rosario, and I am an ELL teacher in North Syracuse Schools. I work primarily with second and third grade students, and some of these students are in CTD classrooms, so they do also have disabilities. I'm also a member of our RBERN OCM BOCES ELL Council. This is where I collaborate with other teachers from our area, and we facilitate and create professional development about English language learners for all teachers. I've been teaching for the last 8 years upstate, and I've had a background in special education. I started in an inclusive classroom in special education and general education, and then I kind of moved into the ELL role. So I've really been able to see from both perspectives how this is a big issue. So this is our agenda for today. We're going to talk about the why is this important and why this happens. We'll talk about the RTI MTSS framework and that RTI guidance that came out in 2010 of how to include ELLs in that process. We'll go over some targeted interventions and talk about some resources. And of course, we'll have times for questions and comments. All right, so our big why, right? Why is this a big topic? Why is this important? Well, in 2021, I did an action research project through AFT where I really got to focus in on this and look at policy of why does this keep happening? Why are we I kind of saw that we were over-identifying ELLs in our district, and 17% of ELLs at the elementary level were being identified as students with disabilities, especially in speech and language and in learning disabilities, primarily in reading. And we were really looking into why was this happening? Well, when I put out the survey and we were looking at the research as to why this was happening, it was because teachers were not collaborating with each other. They weren't AIS or interventionists weren't talking to the general ed teachers, and the ELL teachers were being spread so thin that they weren't always part of those PLC or collaborative team time meetings. So they weren't always being invited to that table where you go to refer a student to special education. So there was a variety of reasons of, there was a lack of communication with all of that, as well as the lack of professional development for the AIS and special education teachers surrounding why students were struggling in certain areas. So one example that I think is a perfect example to share of how this happened was we had a student who spoke Arabic, and in the Arabic language, there's no CH digraph, it's SH, and that student was overusing SH for CH. They're also struggling with short vowels, which we know there's interchange. That's another difficulty that Arabic students tend to have when they're first learning English, and they were receiving ELLs services and they seemed proficient enough, right? They did develop that social language skill. However, they really weren't making progress, but nobody was really looking at that language difference. They were just seeing, oh, these interventions aren't working, we're going to keep moving them through the system. And it wasn't until we got to that point where we were really looking at the language difference where we said, wait a minute, let's stop and focus on the students' primary language needs, right? And let's look at the language difference between Arabic and English to kind of turn our targeted intervention there. So, this program just kind of happened all the time, right? They were being put through this cycle because, again, the lack of professional development for all the educators that were involved with working with the student, the lack of collaboration between the ELL teacher, the SPED teacher, the AIS teacher, and nobody kind of really knew what they were looking at. So it's really important. What came out of this for us was to create protocol and kind of create a really collaborative system where we all sit, we all talk and use our expertise, where we're looking at those important aspects of that second language acquisition process. So first and foremost is kind of looking at what does New York State say, what should that framework look like, right? So I am going to make this a little bit bigger. I know it's kind of hard to see. This is a kind of hard flow chart to read anyways, but the first thing it says that, your ELL is experiencing difficulty in the classroom, right? So the teacher needs to examine their instruction and adjust so that it is linguistically and culturally responsive. So I want to take a minute, and I have a couple of Jamboards that I'm going to share in the chat. And I really want you to think about, what does culturally and linguistically appropriate teaching look like? So I'm going to go ahead and share this in the chat. And if it doesn't work, by all means, just put your thoughts in the chat. And I'm going to share both because I know that Jamboard only lets so many open up at one time. But go ahead and take a couple minutes and really think about, what does that look like to be culturally and linguistically appropriate?
What happens if you just
So I'm seeing multisensory, taking into account cultural differences, using multiple modalities, visual aids, activity-based. I love it. right? Seeing and hearing different languages, using students L1 to support their L2. That's huge. You know, we should do this whenever possible. I'm not sure how many people are in dual language classrooms, but I know that I always admire and I'm always very envious of people who are able to be in dual language classrooms because of all the translanguaging that can be happening at that time and can be really supportive. So yeah, you guys really nailed it on the head there. So that should be the very first thing that's happening is culturally and linguistically appropriate tier 1. And I know that can be difficult, especially when programs that are being adopted might not always be the most culturally or linguistically appropriate materials. So really taking the time to differentiate and make those especially linguistically appropriate for all of our students in all 4 language modalities is huge. So kind of going off of that, you know, I love that someone said using the first language to support second language, right? That should be the next thing that should absolutely be looked at. Yes, I will put a copy of that in the chat for you. Like I said, it's not a very clear flow chart, but it makes sense for when you're talking with your team about what should actually be happening when you're creating that protocol and making sure you're following protocol. It's a really good first step to be looking at. So, you know, like I said, if you are able to be in a dual language classroom using that first language whenever possible and really looking at to see if that student is having difficulty in that first language can often indicate that there needs to be extra support in the second language or something else could be happening. I work in a district where we have a very diverse linguistic population. So, and I work with a lot of refugee students who speak Chin, Karen, Matu, Farsi, Dari, Pashto. So because of all the different dialects and because, for lack of a better term, they're kind of low incidence languages, there's not a lot of bilingual teachers, let alone bilingual materials with some of those languages. So it can be difficult for some teachers who are in that kind of situation to use that first language, but if you can have an interpreter or if you can have an assessment that where you can look at that first language, that's the next thing that we should really be doing before we're saying, oh yeah, they need to go down the pipeline and we need to give them only tier 3 and then move them on to what, you know, we call CERT or bring them up to the kind of that round table for special education, right? And then you really want to think about how are you collecting data to show these the supports I'm going to give are working, the student is really struggling, or how can I demonstrate that progress monitoring, right? So we really need to think about how we're collecting it and how we're going to show that, yes, this is working, or yes, it's not working. So the other thing that we need to do is consider, right, that language differences, like I was talking about in the beginning. You know, I shared that story about my one Arabic student, and there's lots of different ways that language differences can show up, and we don't always know what that's supposed to look like or sound like, because like I said, you know, if you are in a dual language classroom, or if you do have the same if you are able to be literate in that same language as the student's home language or their first language, you know, you have so much advantage. And again, I'm very envious because I don't always have that ability, but there's an amazing website from Portland State University, and they go through, and I'm going to drop this in a chat because I want you guys to really take time to play with this a little bit, because I think it can be super helpful when you're talking about how should I approach this, or how should I create a targeted intervention for these students. So this website has a lot of different languages, and it'll go through some of the phonemic differences between English and their language. And it also talks about the cultures, so you can learn a little bit more about the students. So I'm going to go ahead and drop this in, and I want you to take time to really think about how this can help. What do you notice? Any wonderings you have after kind of playing around with this for a minute? So go ahead and take some time to play around, research something, and then drop it in the chat of any notices or wonderings that you had. Oh no, that's so sad that it's blocking it. I'm not sure why. Maybe because it's a Google site, not like a real website.
They block everything.
Oh
Everything's
no.
blocked all the time.
Oh, so sorry. Well,
It's okay.
when you get home, this will be on the Padlet later. So when you get home, take time to look at it.
Thanks.
They are regularly adding more languages and they're always updating. They know that they don't have everything, but they are updating as they go. And absolutely, this is something that we do share with our speech pathologists and our psychologists. So when they're kind of making those recommendations and when they're looking at the different aspects of languages, it's something super important and critical. And absolutely, the different countries speaking Spanish, I think, is huge, right? We know that Spanish, is a major language that has many different dialects. I know that I'm Puerto Rican and my Spanish is very different than Mexican Spanish or even Argentinian Spanish, right? So it's really important to be thinking about where our students are coming from, what dialect they have, and how those little nuances or dialect differences could be making a difference in that student's pronunciation or their where they are in that second language acquisition process, right? And then what's nice too, I think, is then you can really compare them, use this to compare them to their peers who are also speaking that same dialect or that same language. Like, okay, so they're using the same kind of mistakes, or maybe they're making different mistakes that we don't necessarily notice in those language differences. So maybe that could be cause alarm. So New York State kind of divides it up into two different models. We have that small group model, which is that traditional send them off to AIS. And then you have that problem solving model, which is that more targeted intervention model. So in the targeted intervention model, that's something you can be doing if you have ELL standalone time or even small group in your classroom, where you can be using a resource like I just showed you, where you're really looking at those language differences and targeting those specific things. This is something that I share with my AIS teachers, and we meet. I have students who are in AIS and they also are in standalone ELL, and we meet maybe once or twice a month to kind of go over what interventions we're using and how our students are progressing. Are they hitting those targets that we really want to see them hit, or are they still having trouble? So this has been a great tool to kind of use. Oh, I'm so sorry. I clicked so quickly. So this has been a great model for both of us to kind of really look at and to see, yes, the student needs more of that AIS additional support. And these are some ways that they can support that second language acquisition process in AIS. And we can also use that data to show, no, they don't need to go to special education, or yes, they're still struggling. So based on all of this progress monitoring that we've collected together, we can kind of go to the table, because then we have even stronger data, because again, you're collaborating together. So the really big takeaway I've taken, not even just out of the document, but out of this whole experience, was to make sure that we have a collaborative protocol in place, so that way everyone's not on the same page, and it's not just the ELL teacher's job to handle the student, or it's not just push them off to special ed and never look at them again, right? We need to be making sure we're working together, because again, we know that students can be both linguistically gifted as well as having a disability, but we want to make sure that we are providing them the correct supports along the way. So like I kind of said, you want to make sure your team is either looking at other interventions, thinking about if they're culturally and linguistically appropriate for that student. You want to make sure that you're either readjusting the plan, or you're requesting assessments, and potentially in both languages if possible, or getting an interpreter to kind of help with that. And also, I didn't include it on the side, but something that I've found very eye-opening and important is including a family interview in this process. And I know it mentions it in the flow chart if you were taking a look at that, but it clearly shows that when you talk with the families and kind of get to know their language background, you can learn so much, and you can understand like, oh, they really had I had one student once who they received speech in their home country, and I didn't know that until, we had that conversation. And because I realized they received speech, I'm like, oh, well, they can receive speech here too. This is what we can do to kind of help support that process. Or yes, they had a language delay, but I didn't think anything of it. Or they speak, their home language at home and English at school. So they're not receiving as much of that English. They're not hearing that English at home, which could be kind of hindering that development, right? So there's so many different factors that you can learn from just doing the family interview before just assuming on our own with all the data in front of us. So making sure the family is involved is so important as well. So the next thing that I want to talk about is targeted interventions. So before I go into what targeted interventions that have worked for us, I want to, if you can go back into the Jamboard, and if you toggle over to, I think it's 3 and 4, I put 2 slides on there. What interventions do you currently use that are working with your ELLs? Seeing Wilson reading, tier 2, tier 3 reading. You were already using that RTI process. Haggerty. Using home language to translate directions and clarify the meaning. That's great. Yeah, and seeing that the big ones are AIS, giving them AIS, Science of Reading program, Wilson. I like homework clubs, using graphic organizers, Sunday, all really great, already research-based targeted interventions that we know are successful for ELLs. Science of Reading, I think, is great because it already ties in a lot with second language acquisition, right? We know that ELLs do really well with explicit direct phonics instruction, and I think Science of Reading kind of ties into that and gives that gen ed teachers a window that they might have not have had before to use explicit direct phonics instruction, and gives them tools to use that with. Absolutely. So some research-based evidence programs, you want to really think about how is it including ELL supports and how are you progress monitoring? Again, what data are you going to bring to the table when you say, no, the student doesn't need any more intervention and here's why, or yes, the student needs something else than the general program than what we're doing. So some targeted interventions that that you can use are Road to Reading, or foundations. I know I saw Wilson Foundations, I saw Sunday, Haggerty, all really great programs that can really explicitly target that point that you want to do. So I know that in our district, we use BLAST as well as Road to Reading in AIS, as well as sometimes in our ELL standalone. And what I like about these programs is that you can really target on that language difference. So like the example that I gave earlier with the Arabic student, we could really target those blends, those diagraphs that he was struggling with. We really targeted those short vowel sounds, and it gave us a clear way to be able to do that. It gave us, it gives you every tool that you need. And even though these programs were designed for monolingual students, I think because you can kind of make it your own and target the language, they really do make a difference in that child's learning and get them, out of AIS back into the classroom. And this is another phonemic inventory website that I want to share with you that gives you, again, more linguistic information across different cultures. They give you information about different refugees. They give you, again, the Portland State University, different websites to go to kind of look at the different dialects as well as the different phonemic inventories and different information about the culture. So I'm going to go ahead and drop this in the chat, so that way you guys can take time to look at that. And I don't know where my chat box went. Oh, here we go. Sorry about that. Everyone went to the bottom. So like I said, I'm dropping that one in the chat just for you guys to take a moment to look at it. Again, it's just another different phonemic inventories of all the different languages. This one I have not seen be updated as much as the Portland State University page. However, I think this one has a little bit different information and a few more languages than the other one didn't have. Does anyone have any questions so far?
I actually have a question. Do you by any chance work with any students that are Cleary or deaf students?
No, I currently right now I do not, but that is, I know that that is a big thing in the community. I know that we have a lot of Nepali students who are hard of hearing and are deaf. So right now there is one ASL and Nepali interpreter that they are working with to kind of get them to school to kind of help support some of that.
Okay.
So I don't have a lot of resources on that so far, but I know that is something big, and I know it's something that we're lacking in resource just because there are, there are few Nepali or Burmese interpreters. There's even fewer people who are bilingual in ASL or English, as well as, Nepali Sign Language or, Burmese Sign Language or something like that. I know that our BOCES has really great audiologists that work with our RBERN, that they partner up together. So I don't know if that's a resource or a way that you can look into as well. But yeah, I know that is a big issue and something that I think we all need to dive deeper more into as far as research goes. So like I was saying, so these are different phonemic targeted interventions that we use. Another piece of, I think that is huge, is the vocabulary piece. So, I think 4 squares are tried and true. I know concept maps are another really great way. The SIAP method is another great way to teach vocabulary. I really love concept building and building that oracy with the SIAP method when I'm doing targeted interventions with my ELLs, because it allows students to kind of create their own definitions. And we just finished the plant unit in our science class, and I use that in a small group with all my students, and it was just so nice to be able to see students come up with on their own, oh, the roots and the stem work together because the roots are like a straw for the stem. And I was like, yes, exactly. They were able to kind of produce all that language on their own because we're really diving deep. We're making meaning of language. You're creating that morphology piece for the students because we were able to actually spend time building that vocabulary. They were able to participate, and it wasn't seen as, there's so many times that I hear students won't participate because they because they don't know anything. And it's like, no, they do know. You just have to, allow them ways to access the curriculum. So I know that we've taken a lot of time building vocabulary, but it's made wonders on the other end of what students have been able to produce. I know that's always the fear, is like there's never enough time in the day, but I think taking the time to do some 4 squares or to do some concept mapping for your students really makes a difference into what content they're able to produce after the fact. So progress monitoring, right? This is a huge piece, because again, when you're going to the table for special education, or if you want to show the data that they don't need to go that route, right? What do we need to do? So one of the tools that we use is Elevation. I don't know if anybody else's district uses Elevation, but it's a great way to kind of keep everything in one place. So this program pulls all of our information from School Tool, and they allow us to create goals in the 4 language modalities there. They allow us to create, it's almost like a language IEP, but it's a language plan that I literally hand to all the teachers that are working with that student. So that way, we can make sure we're all on the same page of what that culturally appropriate and linguistically appropriate teaching should be looking like in that classroom, when the L teacher is also not in the room, right? Because we know that we're in 10,000 places at one time. So that's been a great way. And it's also been a great way to just kind of keep track of all the data and keep track of that progress monitoring. We also we're just in the process, and I can show you what ours looks like. Again, this is like our beginning stages of it. We created a baseline data checklist, and we kind of keep it just to make sure that we have enough data. So this is what it looks like. So before we go to what we call CERT, which is our table, a round table where we talk about if the student potentially needs a label or not, we make sure that we look at all of these different things. So, so it has a student HLQ and family interview been reviewed to kind of look at that language history. We're looking at that family interview to make sure that we really know this family well. We really know their language background, and we know kind of how that one is interacted. Unfortunately, I'm not able to share this one because it is brand new to our district. But this is something that I can share. Where we got this idea from is from Dr. Catherine Collier. She has a book, and I'll put the links to her website and the book in the chat. This has been an amazing resource for our district. I don't know if you can see, it's called Separating Difference and Disability. And she is an amazing resource. She's like the guru when it comes to all of this stuff. And we've been really honing in on all of her information. Another great district upstate that has kind of used her to create an amazing protocol is Rush Henrietta. Jamie Scripps over at Rush Henrietta has done an amazing job with her district of creating protocol on how to make sure that they're not over identifying their L's. Their numbers are crazy low for identifying L's as students with disabilities, but because they've really kind of honed in on everything that students really need, and making sure that they're going through every piece of data. They're collecting a lot of data in all the 4 language domains to really make sure that, that all teachers are teaching to L's. So kind of taking a look at, their first language development and language dominance, right? We know that dual language learners, their language dominance might be a little bit different than a transitional bilingual, right? We want to take a look at if the student had academic difficulties in their native culture in their home school before they came to the United States. Did they have an IEP in another country? And what did that look like? What resources were they being provided? And you want to make sure that linguistically and culturally appropriate RTI is being implemented and tracked. And you also want to take a look at the average growth for the amount of time in US schools. Again, Dr. Catherine Collier has a great language acquisition chart where she kind of breaks it down into how many years in school and how that language acquisition has developed. And again, you want to be looking at your goals for the 4 modalities, so listening, the speaking, the reading, and writing, and kind of see if they're on target. how they are in their current language proficiency and what they need to do more. So again, this is kind of new to our district, so I'm sorry I can't share it, but again, if I will put all of Dr. Catherine Collier's stuff in the chat because you can find a lot of what she did there. And I want to make sure that I'm taking time to answer questions and collaborate. This is Dr. Catherine Collier, information to her website with all the books and information there. She's, again, really great. She's a guru in all of this. It's a great book, and she has a lot of other really great resources to kind of use to create protocols with your district. Is there any other questions that anybody has? I have if you want the slides, I have a QR code that you can see the slides from. There. Yeah, so we are working on using there's a tool, and I can't think of the name of right now. There is a tool to use for a language dominance. Let me see if I can find it, but there is a tool that our district is using for that. We don't see an under-identification of ELLs in our district. However, in the Syracuse City School District, they were going so far the one way of over-identifying ELLs that they kind of went backwards in the other, where they don't, they don't really identify ELLs anymore as students with disabilities. And some of them, definitely do have a disability, and they need to. So I've seen the pendulum swing both ways, where people get so scared that they don't want to identify anybody, but then they, at the same time, they don't know what to do, so they're over identifying everyone. So I think, using that RTI resource as a guideline to really make sure that your district is establishing a protocol that's true to you is really important. Right. Does anybody else have any other questions? Yes, thank you for having me.